Muchas gracias por acompañarnos en este webinar. Es el primero del año. Esperamos que estén iniciando de manera muy exitosa este 2020 y que sea muy próspero para todos ustedes. Nos da mucho gusto iniciar esta serie de webinars mensuales que tendremos en la MITI. Estamos iniciando con el pie derecho. Este es un tema muy importante de ciberseguridad. El webinar del día de hoy es Street Hunt Workshop. Es una guía práctica para identificar proactivamente amenazas cibernéticas. El objetivo de este webinar es proveerles a ustedes las instrucciones paso a paso y consejos prácticos para que puedan llevar a cabo las amenazas de Fileless Attack, Persistent Attacks, Lateral Movements, Credential Stuffing y más. Estamos muy gustosos y muy honrados de contar ahorita con un experto en ciberseguridad, presentando a Bryan. Él es Sidian Security and Bantam Technology Managing Partner y se desempeñó como director de tecnología para Cyber GRX, así como arquitecto en jefe de Endgame. Previamente, colaboró como director técnico en el Departamento de Defensa de los Estados Unidos. Desde 1998 hasta el 2001, cofundó y dirigió un grupo de investigación de seguridad en su universidad. Él y su equipo fueron publicados y avalados por la IEE, que es de Engineers, y por la ACM, que es Computing Machinery, en temas que incluyeron la infraestructura de clave pública, arquitectura de redes virtuales VPN y ethical hacking.
Good morning, buenos dias, everyone. So today we're going to be discussing threat hunting, or what we like to call thinking like an attacker, basically taking the offensive view in discovery of threats inside of your network. We're going to break this down into several different areas and eventually kind of lead this into some hands-on opportunities that we'll discuss at the end of the webinar. So first, to get an understanding of threat hunting, we have to kind of break this out. A lot of traditional security products and activities are very reactive. They look at specific indicators of compromise. They look at different signatures of behaviors that will indicate and allude to something going wrong, something possibly have happened on your network. The problem is this introduces a significant dwell time or significant lag in detection to where that attacker can spend time in your network, taking your data, possibly destroying information before anyone is aware of the threat. So with threat hunting, we're taking that proactive approach. We're stepping out and looking at what is happening and searching for these activities so we can identify them as quickly as possible. And it's still very much a human process because the analysis and analytical approach required in threat hunting, can be aided by technology, but it is still very much kind of that human person. And as I mentioned, many of these attackers, they're going undetected for more than 6 months. Dark Tequila, which we spoke about last May at a conference, was a specific piece of banking malware in Mexico that went undetected for nearly 5 years. So when we talk about threat hunting today, all of that is how can we reduce the time to detect that attack so we can quickly find them, quickly eliminate them, and hopefully improve our security so that they cannot get back in. In addition, a lot of the SOC work that goes on inside of your network is responding to a large portion of threats, many of which are false positives. But let's just say that while the SOC might get 80% of those threats, that's still 20% of a sophisticated attacker that knows how to bypass traditional security products, knows how to maybe live on the land and use existing functionality in your operating systems and your networks that makes it harder to detect. So threat hunting is a way to really focus on that 20% hard problem. So when we want to start threat hunting, the first thing that we have to look at is information synthesis, right? We're going to look at a large variety of information. This might include endpoint data from specific computer hosts, and those computer hosts might be different operating systems. So getting all of that into one place. It's probably going to hopefully include network information, whether that's an intrusion detection system, a more advanced network monitor with some sort of machine learning models, as well as it might include physical security controls like badge readers and security systems to know, hey, if this account is being used at 2 o'clock in the morning, is that person inside the organization, or are they not there physically, indicating that maybe that account was compromised? We also need to know what we're looking for. We're going to talk here soon about structuring the hunting, and that's really important, that we have to know what to look for. As you work inside of your organization, or if you're evaluating the security of your organization, you really have to have a good comprehension of what are the risks that we face. If you're operating in the financial world, there are a lot of attackers that specifically focus on banks. And what is the risk that operating in the financial world is going to just bring into your organization automatically? Or energy and utilities, pretty much the same way. What kind of threats and risks are specific to your organization? Also, where are the crown jewels, the sensitive information that an attacker might target you for? That might be intellectual property, it might be financial resources, things that an attacker can sell or that an attacker might want to sabotage. These are those prioritized requirements that you really want to focus on when you're thinking about hunting, so you can know, hey, how is someone possibly accessing that information, and is it legitimate or not? So first, we need to become the hunter. When we talk about a hunt team organization, large organizations like banks, they're going to hopefully have their own full-time capability to do this, where someone can, essentially operate as a threat hunter 24/7 in that organization. However, not many organizations have that luxury. Many organizations do not even have their own security operations center. So they might have someone that, part-time is providing hunt services in addition to their normal duties. Or they might seek out a organization that specializes in that skill set and have that as essentially a staff augmentation or outsourced capability. These threat hunters have to be able to quickly gather data throughout the entire organization. So having the right authority, depending upon where they're at in the organization, if it's full-time, part-time, or outsourced, being able to do all of that is going to require that authority and priority so that they can quickly get out and respond. When we talk about skill sets and the qualifications to be part of that hunt team, it's really a lot of different dimensions. Obviously, you need to have a background in security. And when I talk about security in that first bullet, I'm really talking about more of the defender capabilities. So someone that's been part of incident response, knows how to analyze that information and determine, hey, this is how an attacker got in. This is how they were able to possibly exploit a system due to, this patch being missing, or the inability of maybe it was a 0-day that we just couldn't defend against. So the malware that's being used, the exploit that got thrown, possibly everything that a defender or blue team is going to see. On the threat detection side, we start talking about the offensive tools. What are some of the tools that we might know about, techniques as well, that on the offense, I'm going to use like a red team to break into a network. IT operations, very important. Understanding this is a big part of what is normal inside of the network. What are the operating systems we use? How do we deploy software? How do we install software? Everything in the operations environment so that we can kind of determine what should and should not happen. And then communication. All of this has to eventually be talked to a non-technical audience. So how can we communicate effectively, not just across the team, but to the executive team, to the managers, to the shareholders and customers, especially after a potential breach has happened, so that everyone is informed throughout the entire process. The incident manager is a very important role because this person is really doing a lot of that blocking and tackling for the rest of their team so that the rest of the team can do the hands-on technical work. This incident manager is that technical authority that, again, when we talked about authority, is going to have the ability to say, hey, go investigate this, go and search out, talk to finance, talk to human resources, or talk to engineering, and make sure that they have all of the access to the information. The response analyst is that person or persons pulling in all of that data from the different sources and trying to synthesize a summary of what actually has happened. Obviously, communication is critical to this role, as well as the ability to quickly triage and determine, hey, this is important or this is not important. Oftentimes, we'll also need a malware analyst, someone that can really, is great at reverse engineering or great at understanding, hey, let's take this apart, let's deconstruct this so we can understand, hey, this was, specifically targeting this kind of file or these kinds of people. And we can kind of get an idea of what might the attacker be interested in, so we can make sure that, again, our security is protecting that targeted information. And then the operations staff, again, with that IT background, understanding, hey, these are all of the areas that operating systems, network configuration, everything that's going to help us determine what is, again, normal and what might be malicious for that attack. And then hunting, we're specifically kind of focusing on behaviors and evidence. As we mentioned previously, this is that top 20%, some of the more sophisticated attacks that are going to slip past our traditional antivirus products or our traditional intrusion detection systems, and alerts and IOCs may not necessarily identify them. So we're going to focus on behavior and evidence of those attacker techniques in tradecraft, and we'll get into some more examples of that shortly. We need to understand those offensive tools and techniques so we can ask and answer, how did they get into the network and why? That's very important when we talk about these hunting, is how did it happen and then why did it happen? If we can answer those two things, we can prevent that attacker from coming back another time. So jumping into hunting. Everything that we're going to be doing is specifically looking for different artifacts and indicators. If you think about this in a typical criminal detective type scenario, every contact is going to leave some sort of evidence. If someone breaks into a house, they're inadvertently going to leave fingerprints. They're inadvertently going to leave footprints. They're going to touch things and move things, even if it wasn't what they were ultimately searching for, but it's going to happen along the way. So metadata, I believe everyone's probably heard that term, but that's data about data. So timestamps, size, last accessed, first accessed, things of that nature. Metadata becomes very important, and we're going to look at that through all the different dimensions. Everything on the file system, at the network level, your applications and authentication records, all of this provides that trail of clues that a traditional detective might start looking for when they're trying to solve a more traditional case, but we're going to be doing that at the digital level inside your network. An example of some tradecraft that attacker might do, right, is they're going to start with that initial access. And that might be because they, in a small percentage of use cases, they might have a 0-day that we had no way of protecting ourselves from. But it very more oftentimes is due to configuration error. Maybe remote desktop was left open to the internet, or a a weak VPN protocol was being used, and an attacker that scanned for it was able to connect to that VPN. So that initial access is how they first get into the environment. Once they do that, an attacker is almost always going to want to have some sort of way to maintain access and control into that network. So they're going to introduce and possibly install some new tools into that network. Once they're in, they almost always are going to have to elevate their privileges. Typically, if a phishing email, for example, is going to come in and one of your employees or colleagues opens that phishing email, that attacker might only have access to that person's account, and that person may not be an administrator, they may not be in the department that the attacker wants to get to. So once they first access that victim through spear phishing and then establish control to that computer, they're going to want to elevate privileges to system or to some other administrator inside of the network. And as part of that, because they want to start moving laterally across the network, they're going to start to enumerate and scan for other hosts. During that time, they'll continue to access, collect, and then exfiltrate data. And by exfiltrate data, we're saying they're pulling that data out of the network over their C2 line so that they can analyze it in their own spaces. And then beyond just collecting and stealing information, we're seeing a lot more destruction and damage happens, for example, with ransomware, where once they're at this stage, they can start to wreak havoc inside of the network in a very destructive way. So all of these different steps in this tradecraft example are places that we're going to find all of those different clues, all of those different pieces of evidence as a threat hunter that we can start to pull this picture together as to how the attacker first got in and what were they doing. Our response analysts and triage analysts are going to have to synthesize all of those different points of data. So it's not just one tool or one linear path from that previous example that the hunt team is going to have to look for. They're probably combining multiple techniques, multiple sets of tools that those response analysts are going to have to pull together to really establish what that trail was. One of the things that's going to work in our favor is likely that evidence is going to be in a very condensed timeline. For example, there was a recent situation that we were involved in where we could see that there was RDP scanning coming in at a certain date, and then within a few days, heavy traffic coming in over the RDP protocol. That condensed timeline was where we were able to say, hey, this is actually happening, this is all part of this same attack. Very important to note that not all attacks are going to include malware. Malware is getting harder and harder to protect. Security is improving to some degree on malware. So many attackers are leveraging functionality inside of the environment like PowerShell or different fileless attacks to bypass many of these security products. We also have a very large insider threat concern that organizations should look for the same way that they're doing threat hunting for an outside attacker. That insider threat is likely not going to use malware and is going to use their own access, their own privilege inside of the network to damage, destroy, or steal information. So those insider threats are also critical to look at without any malware being leveraged. But again, they're almost always going to have to elevate privilege. So that's another good hook to where we can quickly identify, hey, this is possibly something going wrong. And then almost always, more than one system has been involved in the attack. And we'll discuss here shortly why that's important. Unknowns are going to be a large part of your threat hunt. Not everything is going to be easily identified black and white. We get a lot of our triage through our tier 1 and tier 2 teams here that it could go either way. So a couple different things when we talk about how do I know if this is going to be malicious or this is benign, I want to look at the context of that event or context of that evidence. First, prevalence. Is it common? Is it kind of everywhere in my network, or is it isolated to possibly just a few machines? Is it an outlier? So that might be able to be something contextually we can determine this is fairly new and this is this is not common throughout the entire network. And again, that recentness, like I said, this is fairly new. Is this something that we've seen a lot of over time? For example, a lot of system administration tasks or things that might be scripted and running on the network. Has it been that way for months, or is this something that just started and we're starting to kind of roll that out? So is it new or is it old is going to help kind of put context into that. And then behavioral patterns. Is it something that's common? For example, if I have someone in human resources that all of a sudden begins accessing a lot of financial information that they don't typically look at, or maybe someone in finance that begins to access source code repositories, you know, that's not typical behavior. And that might be something that quickly identifies, hey, this is probably something that needs further investigation. So tying all of these different methods together gives us context to those unknowns and lets us figure out if, you know, more information needs to be obtained, or if we can make a decision based on the information that we have. All of this is critical to developing an environment baseline. So here we talk a lot about, again, threat hunting being that proactive, not a reactive event. So even ahead of having any sort of key indicator to compromise or knowledge of a compromise, threat hunts should begin so that this baseline can be created and started. It's important for the security department and the hunt team to understand, is this typical in this network? We see a lot of, not every network is the same. Many organizations will use, you know, software that looks malicious. A lot of security software typically looks malicious to other security software. So what is typical? Do we see these kinds of things running often, or is this something that is fairly new? And then what portions of the network typically talk to one another? Again, like I made the example with human resources and engineering, or human resources and finance. Hopefully many of these networks are not flat networks, that there are some natural segmentation or natural compartmentalization, so that, you know, bordering departments or network borders can be quickly identified to, hey, I'm seeing this, you know, I'm seeing this person in this part of the network talk to this other part of the network. Privileged access. I'm seeing a lot better discipline here, where maybe people with domain admin or administrative privilege have separate accounts for when they need to use that privilege versus the ones they use normally every day. So how often are they using those privileged accounts? During what, you know, is it typically something that's business hours or during established maintenance windows? So we can begin to identify, hey, I'm seeing privileged access by this user, and it doesn't seem like it's in the normal time frame. And then those crown jewels that we talked about. Who are the people in the network or the teams in the network that are going to have access to that? You know, the people that can maybe do the bank wires, or the people that have access to algorithms or certain intellectual property. You know, who has access to that, and how do they access it? And are we starting to see anything that's out of the norm and different? So all of these questions should be answered by your threat hunt, so that we can begin to build that baseline. We can begin to quickly understand again what is normal, so that we have less of those unknowns when we start collecting evidence. So we're going to talk a little bit about MITRE ATT&CK. We talked a little bit about this at a conference last May in Mexico City. We talked that threat hunting should be structured, right? That we have very specific goals and very specific problems that the threat hunt should be focused on. And all of that is so that there is a way to define, was this threat hunt successful? And is there a way that we can measure the organization's effectiveness and the overall security maturity of the program based on that threat hunt? And MITRE ATT&CK is one of a few different frameworks that are available for this, but it is becoming, I would say, the premier framework for many of this. For those that haven't heard about it or looked into it, we'll have some contact information at the end of the webinar. But there is quite a bit of information out there, and a lot of both, whether it's a pen test or a threat hunt or different security products that your organization may be reviewing MITRE ATT&CK and how they fit into MITRE ATT&CK is a key thing. So this is mainly just a reference. There's the website in the image for more information. But what this does is at the top there in the blue, you have all of the different techniques that, tactics that an attacker might leverage. And then below it in the rows, you have all of the individual techniques that would employ that. And you can actually map how the attacker, maybe moved from left to right in the framework, as well as, again, with your specific organization security tools and processes, how quickly were you able to detect that or prevent that particular stage of the attack from succeeding. So a little bit background on MITRE ATT&CK. I think it's important for everybody to know. Again, it stands for Adversarial Tactics, Techniques, and Common Knowledge. This has been going on for about 10 years. Started in 2010, covers all of the major operating systems. So there are models for Windows, of course, Linux and Macintosh. There are newer framework matrices with MITRE ATT&CK for exploitation. So that is the pre-attack, meaning left of initial access. So that's going to get into more information about how that attacker was able to gain the access to the network. Mobile attack covers mobile devices. This is obviously a threat that every organization faces because those mobile devices are typically personally owned. So it's the bring your own device model, and that phone is going to continually move across any sense of a perimeter and could possibly either introduce threats or provide a method of data exfiltration. There's also a new industrial control system, ICS, attack framework for energy and utility companies. So the framework is becoming very mature and is available for everyone to look into and adopt in their organization. Again, those tactics are those short-term tactical goals that the attacker is going to go after, that top blue bar. The techniques, how we did something. So again, if my tactic is initial access, my technique might vary from stolen credentials, I have a password, or I use spear phishing, or I use an exploit. So those would be different techniques of the same tactic. And then common knowledge. If you visit and look at the MITRE ATT&CK page, you'll actually see a complete deconstruction of many of the known advanced persistent threats. So you can look at this major Russian campaign or this major Chinese campaign. How did they move through the network, and then gauge, would you be able to protect against that? Would you be able to detect that quickly? Or if you had a threat hunt team that you were training and building up, how quickly and accurately would they be able to identify that particular advanced persistent threat. So that common knowledge shared amongst everyone in the industry and constantly improving, constantly expanding is a treasure trove of information for every organization. Highly recommend that everyone looks at that. So when we want to structure this, whether we're using MITRE ATT&CK or we're using any other framework, maybe a hybrid approach, the organization builds on top of MITRE ATT&CK. The first thing that we do is we want to propose that hypothesis, right? We want to have some sort of educated guess as to, we believe something is happening, right? We believe that someone in human resources possibly has been compromised, maybe by a phishing email, and they're beginning to access other parts of the network. So now we need to go look at those other parts of the network to bring in the evidence, gather that information for that synthesis, and say, can we prove this hypothesis? Can we determine that enough evidence supports it? As we mature that, we might want to begin to develop analytics. So we might want to, and that could start honestly as simply as something in Microsoft Excel that is automating some of the analysis as a very basic level into more advanced analytics. If you have, say, a next generation SIM or a tool like Splunk that can then develop analytics on the automation or the evidence that you're pulling in. And then if we can go another step further on that maturity, we can automate the process. So maybe we're automating the evidence collection that needs to come in from these different places, as well as automating that synthesis and analytics step to more quickly provide the response analysts and the investigative lead or incident commander everything that they need to then communicate that up. Documentation, always important. The worst possible thing is that we're not documenting something enough to where we can avoid repeating our same mistakes or avoid the same sort of attack succeeding another time. So documentation is always important as we go along, and then communicate. Again, this is not something that's done in a silo. This has to be typically communicated to your executive team, to your management. So how can you do that effectively up the chain? We might also have a situation, depending upon the severity of the evidence, was this something that was widespread throughout the entire organization? And does this need to be transitioned over to full incident response? So threat hunting is similar to incident response, but not nearly as, I would say, impactful to the organization. When we talk about transitioning to incident response, this is now something that is, affecting the continuity of operations for the organization, or could have significant reputational damage to the organization. So very quickly and efficiently and accurately, that hunt team is going to have to make that decision. So again, is it widespread throughout the network? Has it been in the network for a long period of time? Is this something that just happened, or now are we kind of discovering something that, has unfortunately maybe been there for 6 months, like most attacks? And then how can we map it, or have we mapped it to maybe MITRE ATT&CK or to another framework, so that we can begin to understand, hey, I'm actually seeing a very mature and established tradecraft of a sophisticated attacker. These things are not isolated in nature. These are related events. And what I'm actually seeing is these TTPs and tradecraft that is being used by that attacker. That probably needs to then transition into incident response. And we always want to measure how effective was our threat hunt. Did we confirm our hypothesis? Did we, were we right? Or did we need to go back and revise that hypothesis? Maybe it was too general. Maybe it needs to be more specific, or maybe it wasn't general enough. But again, constantly determining, hey, were we right in the direction that this hunt went or not? Did we have issues pulling artifacts. And that could be everything from a technical problem where we didn't have maybe the right depth of history, we didn't have enough historical context during the threat hunt, or maybe it was an authority issue and we couldn't get another department to work with us during the threat hunt. So how effective were we at pulling in the necessary information? And then again, how did that feed back into the security program? Are we now better at detecting and improving our time to detect in our general security program as a result of this hunt? Truthfully, every single threat hunt, just like hopefully every single pen test, is having some sort of translation back into the overall effectiveness of your security program. That's how you're going to get better. So next steps, we have a hands-on workshop opportunity coming up. I think that a lot of the next steps, if people really want to start getting their hands dirty in this, is best to be done with hands on a keyboard versus necessarily following along on some slides. So I really would like to invite everybody to think about getting hands-on to how do I want to really start to use different tools? How do I want to start using the right teaming with other like-minded individuals to really figure out, all right, how do I look for this kind of attack and make the determination that this is something that's malicious, something that you know, maybe is a type of attack that my current security programs have no way of identifying. Again, get hands-on experience with the tools that maybe your organization has, but the training hasn't been there, or maybe tools that your organization needs to conduct that. And then see some real examples of sophisticated malware or simulations of those APT threats. So that hands-on experience is going to be something that everyone is going to, I think, have a great opportunity to sit through and work with. Some key references for everything that kind of went into this presentation. Highly recommend people go out and take a look at both Endgame and CrowdStrike's guides to threat hunting. I think two of the key forward-leaning organizations in the space. And then, of course, the MITRE ATT&CK framework. All this information is key to learning and improving. If you have any information or would like copies of the slides, please reach out to Cesar. His email address is there. If you'd like a copy of this presentation, as well as information about the upcoming hunt workshop. And please reach out. We'd love to hear from you. Give us a call or drop us an email. Really appreciate everybody's time today.
Les agradecemos mucho. Bryan, we would thank you for your support and answering any question of the attendees maybe have later. Y de todos modos, César Tovar, que es parte del equipo de Sidian. Sidian es una empresa socia de MITI que es experta en ciberseguridad. Y si tienen alguna duda, les estaremos compartiendo también, les mandaremos un correo electrónico con una encuesta de satisfacción, el link para que puedan ver este webinar en nuestra página de YouTube y los contactos para que tanto con Sidian como con MITI, si tienen alguna pregunta o algo que después les pueda surgir que quieran compartirnos, estamos abiertos para apoyarlos en la resolución de ello. Les agradecemos mucho su atención. Estaremos mandándoles también la invitación para nuestro próximo webinar. Va a ir muy enfocado a tema de contratos, de leasing, de licitaciones y de apoyarles también y darles herramientas para tener totalmente institucionalizados sus servicios internos legales. Les haremos llegar esta información y les pedimos que nos sigan. Ahí están nuestras redes sociales, ahí está nuestra página de internet, nuestro correo y nuestro teléfono. Y pues seguimos en contacto. Que tengan un excelente fin de semana. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Bryan.